On a remote oil drilling platform in the Pacific Ocean, 175 miles off the coast of California, the highest leaders of the American government had survived nuclear annihilation. The oil rig, as well as many other secret installations scattered around the country and possibly the world, represented a contingency plan for the American government to survive a nuclear war. While the plan for continuity of government had been around for over a century by the time of the Great War, none as ambitious or as assured as the Enclaves. For decades, the government was building bunkers, radio arrays, and other assets around the country, automating everything from voting machines to farming in the planned hub of their operations, West Virginia. Everything was carefully planned out to ensure the best chance of survival. It all fell apart, but that's not the subject of today. Surely, if the government planned to survive the nuclear apocalypse on an oil rig, they would have heavily defended the oil rig with anti-aircraft batteries and anti-ballistic missile defenses. Yet, we see no evidence of the rig having any defenses whatsoever. This leads me to believe that the Enclave could possibly have had a navy. This is a tricky subject to cover, as the Navy and the Coast Guard are almost completely absent from the Fallout series. The only thing we can really be sure about is that the majority of America's Navy would have been sent to China during the invasion of China. However, there most likely would have been at least one of the 7 fleets stationed around America. The entirety of the Coast Guard would be stationed in North America too. Surely the Enclave would utilize these assets to defend the highest level of government at the oil rig. The Navy and the Coast Guard could prove extremely useful as defenses against Chinese missiles, aircraft, or ships. The Navy and the Coast Guard would also provide easier movement of the Enclave's forces. We know the vertibirds the Enclave uses have limited range, hence why there's a refueling station on the coast. The Navy ships would have much further range and could act as mobile deployment points for vertibirds. There's definitely cause for the Enclave to utilize the Navy and the Coast Guard, but is there any evidence at all that they did? Yes, but also no. There's only 2 pieces of evidence that mention anything about the Enclave and the Navy. The first is in a GNN news script at the Sierra Army Depot in Fallout 2. It's dated 30th of March 2076 and details how the Pacific Fleet of the US Navy had been moved to protect what would become the Enclave oil rig. This would seem to be concrete evidence. However, Chris Avallone later stated that many parts of the Sierra Army Depot, including the news transcripts, needed to be revised. But they never actually were because Bethesda purchased the Fallout IP. So this news script is really up in the air if we're talking about canon. The next piece of evidence is from the tabletop game Fallout Wasteland Warfare. It refers to the Enclave's navy as a few ancient battleships from the pre-war era. I wouldn't consider this to be canon evidence, however, it does at least leave the idea more open to possibility. That's the only evidence we have to draw from in this case. However, there is one more piece of lore that could lead to something. I'm referring to the terminal entries of the Mount Desert Island Naval Base in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC. The story of the naval base is centered around the nuclear submarines still docked at the base. Originally there for maintenance, the sub's reactor was sabotaged by the captain, Arnold Wabash, or however you would say that name. I'm probably going to say it wrong more, after being seduced by a most likely Chinese agent. By the time of the Great War, the sub's reactor was still broken and did not participate in the Great War. Now, where it gets interesting, Captain Wabash's commanding officer, Rear Admiral Edward Grath, was communicating with the captain over terminal networks. These messages can be found on terminals inside the old base. The latest of these terminal entries reads as follows. To Wabash Arnold, from Grath Edward. Subject: Where are you? We finally re-established comms with Mount Desert today, and now your XO tells me you haven't checked in a week. To boot, he says the sub's launch key is missing. I should have thrown you in a cell when I had the chance. The East Coast is gone, and if the democracy was out there, maybe we could have saved New York, or Washington, or Boston. This is on you, Arnold. Their debts are on you. And if by some sick twist of fate you survive this mess, I'll personally make sure it's temporary. We can't be sure, but it seems like this message was sent after the war. The Rear Admiral describes the East Coast as gone, and the way he says finally re-established comms today indicates a prolonged period without them. A Rear Admiral would typically command a small number of ships in a fleet, but could also be a commander of a fleet. So potentially the fleet he's in command of, or partially in command of, could still be operational after the war. Judging by the Rear Admiral's concerns of the East Coast, he's probably part of a fleet stationed in the Atlantic. The personnel at the Mount Desert Island base also seem to have survived the war, and seeing as there's no Navy ships still at the island in 2287, apart from the damaged sub, it could be assumed that any remaining Navy personnel on the island joined up with the Atlantic Fleet, though there is actually multiple fleets within the Atlantic. Now keep in mind, I'm going off the modern day US Navy, when Fallout's Great War occurs about 56 years in the future and in a timeline that diverges from ours around the end of World War II. This map shows the jurisdiction of each Navy fleet, so let's break down what the positioning would look like before the war. The 7th and 5th fleets would most likely be fighting China and its sphere of influence. In Fallout's world, America has stopped providing protection to other nations in favor of only protecting themselves and their assets. The 4th fleet probably would be positioned around Mexico and Cuba. One of the primary missions of the 2nd fleet is homeland defense, so they would still be on the East Coast, potentially backed up by the Canadian Navy. The 3rd fleet would be defending Alaska all the way down to the bottom of Mexico, and of course the Coast Guard would be defending the American mainland as well. As for the 6th fleet, I'm not sure where they would be positioned. And again, this modern day organization of the Navy would probably be different to the Fallout universes. At least in terms of the fleet numbers, the general positioning may be similar. But for the purposes of this video, I will continue to refer to them with the modern names. We can assume that the American invasion forces were targeted by the Chinese when the Great War started, potentially wiping out or severely damaging the 5th and 7th fleets. It wouldn't be impossible to make it back to America, however, knowing the situation, it wouldn't be unlikely that most of the armed invasion forces would either try taking revenge on China or just give up fighting and attempt to start a new life in the remains of Asia. So if we just look at the 2nd, 3rd and 4th fleets, they may have survived the Great War. They would be defending the ocean rather than pressing in to attack, so most ships would be at least decently far away from land. And remember, the nukes in the Fallout universe have a much smaller blast radius than in real life. Rear Admiral Edward Grath was most likely part of the 2nd fleet, and it seems he survived. Even if we lowball it and say only a quarter of each fleet survived, that would still be over 100 ships, and then add up any surviving Coast Guard ships, that would basically be a full power Navy fleet. What would they do next though? As Rear Admiral Grath says, the East is gone, so the 2nd fleet would probably move westwards after linking up with the forces from Mount Desert Island. Then, because we know that they had working communications, the Second Fleet could try to contact the Fourth Fleet, and any Coast Guard units as they moved west. If the remnants of all these forces linked up, they could head through the Panama Canal to reach America's west coast. From there they could link up with the Third Fleet and the oil rig, depending on whether the Third Fleet would already be there. Now here's where it sets up for the future. There's no navy that can be seen in Fallout 2, and the oil rig Enclave took a policy of isolation, essentially abandoning all efforts of rebuilding the world. If the navy parted from the oil rig and attempted to find the rest of the government and rebuild the world without the oil rig, it wouldn't be impossible at least. Real nuclear-powered aircraft carriers can last for decades on their nuclear engines, but in Fallout's universe, their technology, in terms of nuclear at least, is far superior to ours. So the engines would last a lot longer, and it's likely that most, if not all types of ships would have nuclear engines. This would mean that the fleet could act as a mobile base to a certain degree. The only problem would be feeding the crew. After the fleet had left the oil rig, they would need to find a land base first. A possible location could be Hawaii, as it wouldn't have been hit as bad as the mainland. It's also possible that because of this there may have been an Enclave installation in Hawaii. From there, they could establish a network with Alaska, as it would have been hit lightly as well. Although I suspect that the driving factor for venturing all the way to Alaska, because it is very far, would be if there was a large Enclave base there that the Navy contacted with their still working communications. Alaska seems like one of the prime places for a large Enclave base, which I have explained a little before but may do again in a later video. If Alaska and Hawaii were connected again with a sizable navy, they could start taking back the land, obviously starting with Alaska. If the Enclave managed to reclaim Alaska entirely, maybe they would then travel along the west coast of annexed Canada and eventually mainland America. Or perhaps they would send the Navy to Chicago to reconnect with the outposts. Or maybe they're actually the ones who set up those outposts, and Fallout 3's Enclave was in contact with them. The exact details would definitely be very dependent on the timeline and when exactly an Enclave navy would come into play. Bethesda also wouldn't want to make the Enclave too overpowered, so the Enclave would either have to lose one more time, or maybe they just won't make full use of the navy when we meet them. We could even travel to the coast in a future expedition in 76, where we find the Navy. While this idea would be somewhat difficult to implement in Fallout, I think that it provides an interesting element that Fallout has never really had.